Okay, our next speaker will be Dr. Sonja Feist-Price. Did I pronounce it right? Okay. Dr. Feist-Price is an academic ombud from the University of Kentucky and a professor of rehabilitation counseling. She has served as a director of African American Studies and Research Program, director of graduate studies and rehabilitation counseling. Dr. Feist-Price has authored numerous scholarly publications and made invited and referred presentations at international, national, and regional conferences venues. She has been the recipient of numerous awards acknowledging significant contributions to academic research and teaching, including the Rehabilitation Researcher of the Year, Exceptional Researcher of the Year, and Teachers Who Made a Difference. Dr. Feist-Price.
Thank you. And you know, it's tough being the last presenter before lunch. So I'll try and make it engaging and informative as well. And so the first part of my talk will be just a little brief overview of some of the things that I think are really important for us to take into consideration as we move forward with, increasing the level of researchers in the pipeline. Looking for qualified investigators from traditionally underserved racial and ethnic minority populations. And then the second part of my talk will involve you all being engaged in a questionnaire that was circulated a little bit ago. It's on a tannish paper. There are 4 questions, and so I'd like for us to have a moment in my presentation where you can talk with the people sitting next to you in order to answer some of the questions as it relates to what's happening at your institution. I'd like to start off by thanking Dr. Moore as well as his faculty for having me to come and talk to such a distinguished audience today. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to talk about research and as well as talk about my own humble beginnings as it relates to research. Because I really do believe to whom much is given, much is required. And so it's from that place that I do the work that I do, that I work with my students, that I empower students, as well as colleagues so that they can do the very best work that there is to do. So first and foremost, I want to talk about where it all started for me. I first started my undergraduate work at a traditionally white college, but I feel like I really came into my own and started developing as a professional when I attended Southern University, where I got my master's degree in rehabilitation counseling psychology under the directorship of Dr. Madan Kundu. I want to take a moment to just recognize Doreen Miller. Dr. Doreen Miller, some of you may know her, but she was the person that recognized the diamond in the rough in me and encouraged, inspired me to go on and pursue my doctoral studies at Southern Illinois University. And so not only were they encouraging, Dr. Doreen Miller, Dr. Kundu, who would load all of us up in the van and we would go to national conferences, we would present on our research papers, but they talked about the importance of being a part of our national organizations and being contributing members of the research body, and the responsibility we had as students, as practitioners, academicians, to give back to the work that we do. And so I will always remember what they invested in me, and also with Dr. Doreen Miller, who encouraged me to go on to pursue my doctoral degree. And I think it's really telling when I look back at my journey and what brought me here. And I was flying to South Africa to do some research, and I landed in Johannesburg, and I ran into Dr. Miriam Harrison from the University of Kentucky, who was leaving South Africa where she was doing research. And then I got to the Health Sciences Center in Durban, South Africa, where I met Dr. Madan Kundu walking out of the building that I was walking into. And I thought, wow, how things come full circle. Some of the very people that were talking to me, mentoring me, speaking professionalism into me as they were walking out and traveling back to the US. Here I was flying into South Africa to do some research. And so as I talk with you today about some of the research, I'll talk about some of the lessons learned and some things that I think you all can take back as you consider ways in which you can contribute to the pipeline of having more researchers that represent ethnic and racial minority groups in the pipeline. I want to recognize Dr. Atkins because I remember reading your research and seeing myself in that research and thinking, wow, this is great. And realizing how bold she was to communicate some of the findings that she was communicating, because sometimes when you go against the grain, you're not very popular. And so I endeavored to do a similar study in the state that I was in, just looking at some of the closures of rehabilitation service provisions. And some of the findings were very similar 13 years later. And I wasn't very popular in my state because when you call people out and you make reference to some of the things and some of the disparities, it's not always a popular thing to do, but I know that sometimes you have to have courage to withstand some of the things that come at you and communicate what has to be communicated. So, talking about challenges as well as career barriers. And one of the things that I recognize, and whether it be HBCUs or any other university, there are at times challenges to achieving the goals of research. There are extrinsic kinds of challenges that impact researchers, but there are also intrinsic kinds of barriers as well. And so as it relates to some of those extrinsic barriers, I identified negative perceptions, limited expectations, little or no incentives, and a lack of resources. And for those particular areas, it came about because I know that there are times when you want to do great work, but sometimes the system isn't set up for you to carry out some of the work that you might want to do. You might be in a department or in a program where it's more teacher focused and you want to do research, and it may not be as popular for you to do the research. And adding to that, sometimes you might be collaborating with persons outside of your academic unit, and your colleagues are like, well, we're your academic family. What are you bringing to this department? Because research can be a lonely process, and so it's important that people engage with other researchers across the university, that collaborative research process. And so I know from my own experience and also from the research, the literature as well, that there are times when there are extrinsic barriers and limitations that are put in place. And I know what it means when there are a number of courses that must be taught. There are a few faculty to teach those courses. There's advising that must be done. And then there's that faculty that's saying, but I want to do this research project. I have funding. I want to be released for 75 or 50% of my time. And then your colleagues that are in your department are saying, well, who's supposed to teach your classes? And what about these students? And so even when the research dollars come in, sometimes it is still a major struggle and a challenge for research to take place. And so I just really want to help to bring to the forefront some of those extrinsic challenges that faculty members are sometimes faced with. Also, as a researcher, there are sometimes those intrinsic kinds of barriers that we must overcome in order to be successful. And one has to do with feelings of inferiority. That imposter syndrome is like, oh my goodness, I got this grant, I have these things to do, objectives to meet. And sometimes you don't feel as competent and confident to get the work done. And that's the beauty of working with collaborative partners, because different people bring about different parts. And through those different parts, you have a whole, you have a gestalt. And so it's important that with researchers, that they surround themselves with other researchers that might bring strengths to complement the work that they do, that they're not in it alone. I remember working with an educator, and she shared with me the jigsaw method of teaching, whereby several people with certain levels of expertise come together to bring about a lesson plan, shared learning that takes place. And I also see the relevance of a jigsaw research methodology, where you have maybe somebody that might be an expert in statistical skills, somebody that might be an expert in methodology or carrying out some of the initiatives out in the field. And so it really takes a village to get a grant up and running and successful and have the kinds of findings that one would want to have. And so I encourage you all, as you consider this initiative and take it back to your university, that you try and find ways of making sure it's a collaborative partnership among the faculty and that they're not working solo. Because research can be very difficult when it's done by an N of one, particularly when they're not in a community where there's a shared vision for the work that is taking place. And we also know that interest and motivation is very important to research. For me, I love to have fun at whatever I do. You know, if I'm doing research, I want to have fun having to labor over my research, writing my manuscripts, publishing and presenting at conferences. I know research shows that when we enjoy what we do, we're more likely to do it over and over and over again. And you ask anybody that might have started out with an exercise program, why they quit doing it. When you stop having fun doing something, you stop doing it. And so finding ways of helping faculty to make their research fun and innovative as well as informative, because oftentimes the work takes place when families are asleep, when it's the weekend and everybody's out having a good time. Sometimes that's your best time to do research. So if you enjoy it and you're motivated and you have those incentives that are coming from the higher up, you're more likely to get the research done. There is a need for minority researchers. And I know that many years ago there was a need then, there is still a need today. I remember reading the book, Even the Rat Was White, and it talks about the need for researchers. And that was back then, it was many years ago, where it talked about the need for minority researchers, particularly to dispel some of the myths that was in print about inferiority regarding African Americans. And so while some of the things that are communicated are not to that extent, it's not talking about African Americans with smaller brain sizes or less competent, less capable, there is still a need for researchers who understand issues, who have a cultural sensitivity and awareness to do research about some of the things that are impacting our communities. And not only do we do the research, we take it back to our communities and help to empower our communities based upon what we have learned from the findings. So there is a limited number of researchers. There's also a limited number of mentors. I believe that we have a responsibility as we move forward, those of us that are aging out of the rehabilitation research process, to bring others along with us, to not only pass the baton, but to walk alongside people as they are transitioning into their line of research. So mentors are very important to the pipeline, and making sure we have people that walk alongside of people that are trying to get the research efforts successfully implemented. So I mentioned already that there is a need for sensitivity and a greater awareness of some of the issues that are impacting ethnic minority groups as well as racially diverse groups. Oftentimes I still see research that makes statements as though it's reflective of everyone, and then you look at the sample and you look at who's represented in the sample, and if they talk about who's in the sample, the number of ethnic minorities are very little, but yet they assume that the findings are relevant to everyone, and in actuality it isn't. Sometimes the findings may be reflective of the dominant culture, but not necessarily specific to racial ethnic minorities. So there's a need to sometimes peel back the layers and say, what is it that's happening with a particular group of people, and how can we best understand and resolve some of the issues that are taking place? And then for many of us, there's that altruism. I know, Dr. Atkins, I learned that you were from Louisiana. I didn't know that, from Bass Group. I'm from Louisiana as well. I'm from a little town called Jeanneret near Lafayette. And so for me, I always had the responsibility of giving back to others, giving back to my community, giving back to my culture. And as a researcher, that's one of the ways that I'm allowed to do that. You know, I'm blessed with an opportunity to give back through the research that I do. So when we look at sustaining a pipeline for training and mentoring the next generation of researchers, what has to be done? What are some things that must be done in order to not only create but sustain a pipeline for training and mentoring the next generation of disability researchers? I think it's important that we have buy-in from presidents, provosts, and on down the line. But I also recognize that the support has to come not only from the top down, but from the bottom up. Particularly when you're working, if you're in an institution where teaching and service has prevailed within that institution, it really is a cultural shift when you are looking at research and the inclusion of research, especially when there are a large number of courses to teach. There are a few faculty, state dollars are dwindling, and we're having to do a whole lot more with a whole lot less. And so to have a department chair to free up one or more faculty to do research, sometimes in theory it works well, but in terms of the practical applications, sometimes that's where it gets a little bit sticky. And so I really want to encourage the administrators that are here to consider ways of not only sending down the mandate, but making sure that the faculty as well as the department chair understand the importance of research. And for some people who may not be involved in research, that they celebrate the research that's taking place by persons who are doing the research. Not everybody wants to be a researcher, but for those that do, that they get the support and the encouragement from the colleagues to do so. I think that's really, really important. I think it's also to encourage not only inter, but intra-university mentoring. Sometimes there are people within the university setting that might serve as wonderful mentors, but there are times when people might have to go outside of the university to find mentors. And that too must be celebrated. And mentors they may not always look like us. Sometimes it may be someone else. It might be other researchers that are doing cutting-edge research that would be happy to say, come on along, be a part of what I'm doing. I'd love to show you how to get it done. There are also different funding mechanisms that allow faculty to partner with other senior researchers, R21s or R03s, but being a part of other research with faculty at other institutions where research is being done. But not only that faculty will do those kinds of things, but that they are celebrated and encouraged when they step out of that comfort zone or what is considered familiar for that particular institution. I've heard that there are many offices of sponsored projects that are here today, and I think that's wonderful. I want to just kind of highlight some of the services that I think are really, really important to be provided to researchers from such offices. An internal review board is very, very important. Oftentimes you hear of stories where, they were not up to date in some of the trainings and some of the ways of doing things. That is so essential. Making sure that the faculty that's involved in research has matriculated through the IRB process. We know that it can be lengthy, but it's so important that the IRB is an important and vibrant aspect of a campus. I think it's also important when the Office of Sponsored Project can offer different kinds of resources that can be beneficial to the faculty member. So it might be set up where there is a review board to look at a grant proposal before it goes out. Sometimes there are sample proposals on hand for faculty members to look at. Oftentimes researchers are great about understanding the research and the voids that exist in the research questions and ways of going about collecting the data and analyzing the data. But in terms of some of the things like the budget and getting some of the paperwork done and the contracts that must be signed off on, faculty having assistance, getting assistance with those kinds of things, because those are some of the things that might impede a person's success and cause them to lose their momentum when they're trying to get things done. Also, I think it's important when the Office of Sponsored Projects can make researchers aware of different kinds of funding opportunities that are coming down the pipe. And I'm not at all insinuating that your particular Office of Sponsored Project isn't providing these resources, but I'm just saying these are some of the things that are essential in making a researcher successful. Connecting researchers with persons of similar interest. Sometimes an Office of Sponsored Projects might be aware of other researchers on campus that might be doing similar kinds of research, and they can connect people together to collaborate on research projects that strengthen the projects for all parties. And as well as research and training programs and boot camps to help people not only with writing grants, but getting manuscripts completed and submitted and doing some of the things that must be done in order to make their research successful. So I see an Office of Sponsored Project as being of critical importance to a researcher in being successful. Furthermore, in terms of sustaining a pipeline, it's important to have a reduced teaching and advising load. It's wonderful when you get funded, but then the funding is great, but then the reality of how do you pull it off, how do the classes, or how should one take responsibility for the courses or pass them on to other faculty members, advising, service, all the things that must be done in an academic setting. It's important that we have persons to pick up the slack when there are those that are doing the research, because we can't do it all. Incentivizing research efforts, whether it's monies from indirect costs, salary increases, stipends, you name it. It's really nice to get some kind of, not only recognition, but some kind of incentive when research efforts pay off. Up-to-date technology and software, it's so important in terms of getting work done timely, efficiently. That's another very big one. As well as having qualified mentors that the researcher can call, contact, and is always on standby to provide not only resources, but words of wisdom and encouragement. You can do it, you have what it takes. That's also very important for researchers. And I also mentioned incentivizing the mentoring process, because for persons that serve as mentors, sometimes they too are inundated with a lot of responsibilities. And so when all those things are in place, then persons are ready to just delve into the research that they're doing and optimize their ability to transform what's happening as it relates to disability research. And I'm a firm believer that where research interest should ignite one's passion, and passion defines one's purpose. I'm a firm believer in living a purpose-driven life that is based upon one's passion, and I think research allows us to do that. So with the next, and the other slide I have here, it says research must be a priority, and when things are important, we allocate resources, we set goals, we prioritize, and we make it happen. And that's what's important when things are a priority. So with this part of our time with me as your presenter, I'd like for us to look at the handout that was, or the questionnaire. There are 4 questions. And so what I'd like for us to do is just take a couple of minutes on each of the questions, and I'd like for you to interact and talk with the people sitting at the table next to you so we can have some cross-fertilization. But let's take 2 minutes on each question, going through, answering the questions, and that way I get to learn from you all in terms of what's important in terms of making research successful at your institution and not only developing but sustaining a pipeline.
Jake's side, but I think we have to be able to trust that flexibility, and that should not be defined by the institution, because incentives is important, funding, but that's not everything that it takes in order to make it work.
You're absolutely right. And you know, I think about myself, and from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., those were the times when I got the best work done, when everybody was asleep and things were quiet. So you're right, flexibility is very important. Anybody else for number 2?
Yeah, we talked about support, and I'm from a university that really doesn't have this program, but in any program where you're trying to sustain researchers, you need to have the appropriate equipment for them that they need. And also, what I found as Dean of Arts and Sciences is that so many researchers want to know what type of help they're going to have with graduate assistants and research assistants, so giving attention to that. And then the one that I really appreciate hearing voiced here is, I think this is really where the support of the provost and president come in. I mean, once you get them on campus, you need to be able to show through your actions that you're seriously committed to the mission.
Very good point. Thank you so much for communicating that. So let's go with number 3. Question number 3. What barriers may impede the success of minority disability researchers? And there should be an S at the end of the barriers, because we know that sometimes there are multiple impediments to being successful.
Well, we've talked at our various institutions about certainly making sure that you're not just talking about increasing research, but actually allocating resources to it.
Excellent.
The barriers we identified was one, certain faculty workload, but you know, I come from a union environment. Faculty have not had raises in 4 years.
Wow.
To ask them to do anything else, you know, it's a capacity issue at a lot of institutions. And yes, we are working on doing more around integrating research into the curriculum, because we do not have the capacity to release someone to do research. And so that and sometimes senior administration really putting the resources behind the researchers, like we talked about creating an infrastructure
so much. I saw this gentleman and then two hands over here, and I love to see so many hands coming up.
Yeah, it's difficult to jumpstart a research enterprise, and one of the biggest problems is access to literature, journals, online journals. You've got to stay current, books, there's a constant flow of books coming out, and you've got to be able to access those books in your libraries, but journals are extremely important, they're expensive.
Yes.
Being able to go to conferences, because a lot of the work that I accomplished was due to the fact that I networked at conferences. I heard the latest research, the latest points of view, getting to know people, they're going to review your proposals, being on review boards,
Yes.
refereeing for journals. All of these activities are part and parcel of research enterprise, and it's hard to jumpstart those from ground zero. So it is a difficult struggle to get started. Once you get a critical mass going, it sort of starts to self-sustain itself.
Excellent point. Thank you so much. I appreciate that comment. The two people at the front.
Yeah, I think mine go back to my colleague here, back in terms of what happens at a lot of institutions in terms of the area, all those incentives that you talked about earlier as well. Sometimes the lack of salary increases, caps on summer salary, all of those are becoming major issues for, I think, faculty who want to do research and be able to say, well, what's in it for me in terms of, going out, writing these grants, getting the grants in, seeing all this money that's coming, in particular around indirect costs.
Yes.
And then so what's left for the faculty member in terms of doing that.
Excellent point. Thank you so much.
I have 2 points. In terms of barriers, sometimes it could be other faculty. When I was hired, I was asked by the provost, the president, and the dean to implement and develop a research agenda, which I'm trying to do. But then I have a junior faculty who's not tenured yet, who is telling our students, you don't have to do that research project, because they have to do a research project from beginning to end, okay? And he's telling classes that they don't have to do that research project when it is in the syllabus. And as we all know, when it's in the syllabus, it's a contract between the instructor and the student. So I actually had a professor who was, and as I told the provost, sabotaging the development of a research agenda because he's a clinician and wants to just teach therapy. And so, that is being worked on with that professor. And I think that when we're asked by administration, as some of you may be, to implement a research agenda, to get, I'm very fortunate that I have that support. And then the other one in terms of resources, I was sharing with the group that when I came in, we had 7 graduate students with graduate assistantships. 3 were assigned to help the secretary in the front, and 4 were assigned to help professors as gophers to do whatever those professors wanted. So I had the meeting with the president and my dean. I'm the chair of the department, and I told them next year we're having the students, we're reassigning all graduate assistantships. They're all going to be research-based. All students are going to develop their own research project from beginning to end. And among the outstanding research projects, we're going to do a panel at New Orleans at the Society for Social Work Research Conference, and we're taking 8 students to do panels there. We're promoting that with students. And then this year, some of our faculty were screaming and kicking because I reassigned our graduate students to faculty who were actually doing research and needed help. And the faculty, were happy. So sometimes we have resources that are being misused.
Yes, and one of the things we always say in rehabilitation is that sometimes attitudes is the real disability.
Yes.
And I think what you communicated is a classic example of how one's attitude can be the impediment to success. I thank you for that comment, and in light of time, I'll take one comment regarding question number 4. Which strategies might prove fruitful for building a pipeline for researchers? Any takers on that particular question? Any strategies that might prove wonderful? Our buoy representative.
I think that one of the best things is what is going on here is the collaboration across institutions where everybody gets to pool their particular expertise and strengthen everybody else. I think that would be great.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I appreciate your comments. May I have your comments? May I have your comments? I'd like to put that information together, share it, circulate it, so that we can draw from your knowledge and expertise on how to make this a success. We know that a lot of the experts are right here in this room, and so I value your comments. So if you can just move your comments to the end of the table, and then I'll pass around and pick those up. Thank you so much.